It was a stuffy Florida evening, one of those when the air is thick and still, saturated with the scent of blooming honeysuckle and damp earth. The sun had already set, but the western sky still held pinkish-purple glimmers, slowly giving way to the velvety southern night. In the McMullen house, located on a quiet street in Lakeland, life flowed at its usual pace. Mr. John McMullen was reading the newspaper in the living room, while his wife, Elaine, finished washing the dishes after dinner. Their two children, 8-year-old Lisa and 10-year-old Michael, were arguing over the remote control for the television, where the picture flickered due to weak interference, a common occurrence in their area in the evenings. Visiting them was a family friend, a young woman named Sharon Burgess, who had come to see them for the weekend. Suddenly, the peaceful hum of the domestic evening was disrupted. Michael was the first to notice something amiss. "Mom, Dad, look," he shouted, running to the large window overlooking the yard. "There's some weird light out there." John put down his newspaper. Elaine wiped her hands on a towel, and Sharon also approached the window. Everyone's attention was drawn to an unusual glow coming from the direction of a low, shrub-covered hill about half a kilometer from their house. It wasn't the light of headlights or a fire. The light was steady, soft, and it was moving, slowly but surely approaching their property. "What could that be?" Elaine murmured, feeling a chill of inexplicable anxiety run down her spine. The radio in the kitchen, which had been quietly playing music, suddenly hissed and fell silent, plunging into loud static crackle. The television in the living room followed suit. The picture disappeared completely, the screen filling with snow. "That's some strong interference," John frowned. He went to the back door leading to the yard and cautiously peered out. What he saw made him freeze. Hovering directly above the old, sprawling palm tree growing about 45 meters from the house was an object. It had a classic disc shape, perfectly smooth, with no visible seams or protrusions. It wasn't very large in diameter, John estimated visually, maybe 4 meters, perhaps a bit more, and about 2.5 meters high. The object hung absolutely motionless and silently just a couple of meters above the top of the palm tree, its leaves almost touching its underside but not swaying. The lower part of the disc was dark, matte, while the top was crowned with a transparent, slightly convex dome. "Come out here." Quietly, John whispered, beckoning the others with his hand. Elaine, Sharon, and the children, hushed and frightened, slipped out into the yard after him. They stood by the wall of the house, hesitant to get closer. Inside the transparent dome, 2 figures were clearly visible. They sat side by side, facing the direction of travel, although the object wasn't moving. The figures were humanoid, but it was impossible to make out facial features. They were dressed in tight-fitting suits or jumpsuits of pure white, snugly clinging to their bodies. On their heads, they wore devices resembling large headphones or helmets with side elements covering the ears. The figures were motionless, like mannequins, but their presence felt alive, observant. It seemed they were looking directly at the house, at the people frozen with amazement and fear. Minutes dragged by excruciatingly slowly. The object just hung there, silent and mysterious. And then the McMullens and Sharon smelled it, a sharp, acrid odor, similar to ammonia. It wasn't strong, but it noticeably stung the nose and brought tears to their eyes. The children started coughing and rubbing their eyes. "What's that stench?" John whispered, covering his nose with his shirt sleeve. The smell was clearly coming from the direction of the object. Their dog, an old mutt named Rex, who had been sitting quietly on the porch until that moment, suddenly went into a frenzy. He whimpered, then began barking desperately, the fur on his hackles standing on end. He wasn't barking at the object, but rather trying to hide from it, darting around the yard, whining and howling in terror. Then, in a fit of panic, Rex charged at the chain-link fence enclosing the backyard. The mesh rattled, and the dog, tearing a sizable hole in it, burst out onto the street and bolted away, tail tucked between his legs. This scene finally snapped the adults out of their stupor. "We need to call the police," Elaine said decisively, her voice trembling. "This isn't normal. You think they'll believe us?" John countered skeptically, his eyes still fixed on the disc. "What else should we do? Sit here and wait for this thing to gas us with ammonia or worse?" Sharon intervened, pulling a crying Lisa closer. John nodded. "You're right." He quickly went inside and grabbed the telephone receiver. The line was filled with only loud static crackle. "The phone's dead too," he shouted to the others. The radio and television still showed no signs of life, just hissed annoyingly, intensifying the oppressive atmosphere. A sense of helplessness washed over the adults. They were cut off from the outside world, while something inexplicable and potentially dangerous hovered in their own yard, emitting an acrid smell and watching them through a transparent dome. "Maybe it'll just go away?" Michael whispered hopefully, pressing close to his father. "I hope so, son, I hope so," John replied, though he didn't believe it himself. The object hung over the palm tree with unshakable persistence, as if waiting for something or conducting some kind of investigation they couldn't comprehend. John peered at the figures inside the dome. Did he imagine it? Or did one of the figures slightly turn its head towards them? The movement was barely perceptible, smooth, but it happened. They knew they were being watched. This silent, intense gaze from behind the transparent barrier was almost more frightening than the sight of the disc itself. There was no aggression, no friendliness, just cold, detached observation, like a scientist observing insects in a jar. The ammonia smell weakened slightly, but didn't disappear entirely, continuing to irritate their mucous membranes. Lisa sobbed quietly in Sharon's arms. Elaine hugged Michael, trying to appear calm, but her lips were tightly pressed together, and her eyes betrayed her fear. 20 minutes. That's how long, they estimated, this strange standoff lasted. 20 minutes of silence, broken only by the static crackle from the house, the child's quiet crying, and their own rapid breathing. 20 minutes under the intense gaze of two white figures in headphones from another world. And just as suddenly as it began, it started to end. Without warning, without any sound or change in the glow, the object swayed slightly, like a boat on water. Then it began to slowly, almost lazily, gain altitude vertically. It rose higher and higher, maintaining a horizontal position. The figures inside remained motionless. After ascending about 100 meters above the ground, the disc paused for a moment, then shot rapidly towards the hill from which it had appeared. The speed was incredible. In a couple of seconds, it turned into a bright dot and disappeared behind the treetops on the hill. With its disappearance, the static hissing in the house instantly ceased. The television flickered back to life, showing some evening program. Music began playing quietly from the radio in the kitchen. The silence in the yard became almost deafening, but now it was natural, not oppressive. Only the faint, yet still noticeable, smell of ammonia remained as a reminder of the recent visitor. For several moments, the McMullins and Sharon stood in silence, catching their breath and trying to process what had happened. "It's gone," Elaine breathed out. "What was that, Dad?" Michael asked again, but now his voice held more amazement than fear. "I don't know, Mike. Honestly, I don't know." John shook his head, still looking in the direction the object had sped off. The first thing they did was rush to find Rex. The dog was found quickly. He had huddled under the porch of the neighboring house, trembling all over. It took a long time to coax and calm him before he agreed to return to the yard, where the hole gaped in the fence. Only when the initial shock had somewhat subsided did John decide to try calling the police after all. This time, the phone worked normally. He dialed the number and, stammering slightly, trying to remain calm, told the desk sergeant what they had just seen. The disc, the figures in the dome, the ammonia smell, the interference, and the terrified dog. The reaction on the other end was predictably skeptical, but the officer promised to send a patrol car when one became available. About half an hour later, a police car pulled up. Two officers, one young and one older, emerged with flashlights in hand and leisurely inspected the yard. They listened to the accounts of all three adult witnesses, who tried to be as accurate as possible despite their agitation. The officers shone their flashlights on the palm tree, no traces. They examined the hole in the fence, clucking their tongues. They tried to catch a whiff of the lingering smell, but by then it had almost dissipated. They checked the radio and television. Everything worked fine. "Are you sure it wasn't a helicopter? Or maybe some kind of experimental drone?" the older officer asked, clearly disbelieving the story of a disc with humanoids. "It didn't look like any helicopter or drone," John said firmly. "It hovered completely silently. And those figures inside. And the smell. Ammonia, you say?" Maybe someone spilled fertilizer somewhere or some chemicals in the fields. The young patrol